Okay, so welcome back. Today we're going to show you a fairly simple way to read and write files in C++. And you may say, simple, C++? Well, actually, this is really not too bad compared to some other things you might encounter in C++. So we're going to show you a simple way, and we're going to start out with a simple, what's called a CSV file. And here on the right, you can see in my project directory, I'm going to double click on this CSV file. And we're going to start out with this very simple text file called CSV, which is comma separated values. And you can see I've got a number on the first line. I've got a number with a comma and another number. And this you might encounter in engineering where you've got X and Y values you want to plot. So we're going to start out with this, and we're going to run our code, and it's going to read this file, the CSV file. It's going to tell us how many records. There's 4 records. And it's going to put them into an array of values, and I've got my X values and Y values. So I've got this first line is X is a double of 1.0 and Y is a double of 25.63. So it's a simple way to read that in and parse it and put it into an array. Now, you don't need to use CSV files. What we're going to show you is going to work on any type of text file. So for example, in a previous video we were talking about ray tracing and writing some C++ code to make your own ray tracer. And one of the issues we encountered was being able to load in a text file that's called a .obj or object file. And here's a very simple OBJ file right here that defines for your ray tracer application a cube, and it talks about the vertices and the normals and all the other aspects of a simple cube that your ray tracer can then go, if you read that in, your ray tracer can read all this data and use it to generate a cube in your ray tracing software and render it. This, as you can see, is a bit more complicated than what we're working with to start out. But you can see there's all different types of files that you might read in. And this is a little bit more complicated because it's got, depending on what line you're on, it's got different data with different variables compared to this, which has only got 2. So that's going to help us to plan this. We're going to realize that, hey, it's one thing to read the data in as, for example, each line as a string. But the other thing is you're going to have to parse it and you're going to have to make it usable. So we're going to break that into 2 parts. We're going to read the file in as strings, and then we're going to have a separate method that goes through and does the parsing based on what type of file we're using. For this OBJ file, it's going to be a lot more parsing work. But you can see we're going to have 2 methods, one to read the data in and the next method to do some parsing. So now, as we do in all our videos, we're first going to try to understand the concepts rather than just jump in and start writing code as a newbie would do. We're going to try to understand the concepts we need to employ and figure out, kind of design our code so that we get something that we want rather than going through and writing code and figuring out that, hey, we made a mistake, we got to start all over. Let's take a look at some of the concepts we're going to use in order to bring this code in and make it usable. Here is our CSV file, and it's very simple. It's got 4 lines with comma separated values. So let's think about the steps we're going to need in order to bring that in. Well, in the Windows C++ world, first you open the file, right? You have to connect to the file like we did with our serial port communications. You first have to access and connect to the file. So we're going to open the file. Then you have to read the data into some sort of buffer, right? You've got to take all that data and put it in a buffer so that then you can work on it on your computer in the C++. So it's got to be some sort of buffer you put it in. And then we're going to have to parse it and make it usable. So again, we said we're going to use these first 2 items together to make the data into a buffer. And then the parsing is going to be different because the parsing depends on whether it's a simple CSV with 2 numbers per line or it's a very complicated OBJ file or something else. So how are we going to do that? In C++, the way that you open a file and access it is called ifstream, input file stream. And stream is kind of like a buffer of data. So we're going to have an input file stream that opens and accesses the file, and then we need to read it into a buffer. In our case, we're going to use stringstream, which is output stringstream, which basically says take the data that you got using this ifstream, put it into a string buffer that you can then access. And that's why it's an output string stream. It's a buffer that you can then access so that you can go through and do some parsing, all right? So basically two methods that are in Windows that we're going to access in order to do these two functions. So once we do the input file stream and write it to a buffer in output string stream, we're going to have something that looks like this. It's basically converted all of the data into a file into a big long string of data. And notice that it also includes the new line characters at the end of each line. We talked about that in our previous video about reading in from a file what that new line means and what the carriage return means. But basically all of the characters, including the invisible terminating characters, all moved together into one complete string that we can then use and parse however we need to. In our case, I'm going to call that string that has all the contents in one line of data the total CSV contents string, all right? So we use these two methods, we get this big string of data, then we got to go through and we got to figure out, what this is and make it meaningful. How are we going to do that? There is a very nice method in the Windows API called getLine. And what getLine does is it goes through this big long string of data and searches for in this case, a new line character and says, okay, here's all my numbers. Uh-oh, I found a new line character. That means that represents one line, what you see in blue. So it's going to then return this 1,25.63 as a value that it got, and that represents that one line of data. And we're going to take that data that it returns and put it in what we call a record, which is just a string representing that line of data. So we've taken the first line from the CSV and converted it into a string of that one line. We're going to call that record. Then we're going to do that for each line and make a new record. And each time we have a record, we're going to put it in a vector of strings called records using the push back. So you're basically going to take a record, push it back onto the records vector of strings, the next record, the second one, push it back, and at the end of the day, we will have a vector of strings called records that has all of the lines from that file in these strings, all right? And again, it doesn't have to be CSV, it can be any text data, and it's going to be a vector of strings. Once we've got that vector of strings, we can work on it and get the numbers out of it, but this is the primary focus of this first part of the exercise, okay? So now we got to think, how are we going to get this? We said we're going to use ifstream and output stringstream. How are we going to get this? What's the details of this? So let's look into that now. So here's our CSV file. We named it csvtest.csv. It's located in our project folder. And we're going to use, as we said, the ifstream class, and we're going to instantiate an object, and I'm going to call it input file. And that's basically an ifstream class object, all right? And what that does is that's responsible for kind of opening this file and then reading the data into a buffer, all right? So input file opens that file, you give it this name, csvtest.csv. You're going to give this the name, and it's going to, when you run the, when you instantiate this, it's going to run the constructor, and it's going to automatically open the file and read the data. Now, where is it going to read the data? Well, it first has to get a pointer to somewhere in your code that's going to hold the data. So the read buffer method inside this input file class is going to read the data from the CSV and put it into a buffer, but first it needs to get the pointer to that buffer, all right? So where's the buffer located? Well, we said it's in the output stringstream class, and I'm going to call it my stringstream, right? So when you read the buffer, it's going to get a pointer to this my stringstream, and it's going to read all the data into the buffer. So here's my stringstream class called my stringstream, and it holds inside of it a string buffer. So it's basically going to take all of those contents of data from the file, and as we said, it's going to be one long line of data with the values and the terminating characters. All right. So stringstream class, we're going to call it my stringstream, has a buffer in it, and it's going to hold all that data. So then we have to convert that into a string object that we can start working with. And the my stringstream object has a str or string method that allows us to access this buffer. So it's going to convert to a string object, and I'm going to call it total CSV content string, which is all of the contents in this one long string, and it's going to look like this. So again, the process is I've got my CSV file, I instantiate it, and the constructor for this reads that data into a buffer, and that buffer is at the pointer to an stringstream class, and it reads that into the buffer in this class. Then I use the string method of that class to access that buffer, and I'm going to convert that into one big string which has all the data. Then we can go back and parse it. All right. Then we've got this, then we can go and use the get line to get all the data. So that's going to be the basic methodology we're going to use to read text files into a vector of strings. So now once we've done that, we've taken the CSV file, put it into a vector of strings that look like this, then we're going to have to parse. And I'm going to have a separate method to do the parsing because, as I said, you may have a simple CSV or you may have a complicated OBJ file or any other type of text file that you're reading in. So I'm going to leave the parsing to a separate method. And in this case, I'm going to have a method called parse CSV to double, which takes a CSV that looks like this and converts it to some double values. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to parse that based on these comma delimiters and make another vector of strings, and the vector has the individual values. It's gotten rid of the commas, it's just got the individual values in this vector of string. Then I'm going to pull out of that vector of strings some x values that are going to be converted to doubles and some y values. And you see all the red are the first numbers. They're going to be in the x values, and all the blue are the second numbers. They're going to be all the y values. So then I'll have two vectors of doubles that I can go plot or whatever. Again, that's just one example, but it will help us understand how to read in and then do parsing. Okay, so now let's take a look at the code, the C++ code we're going to write to do that simple console application. Again, Visual Studio 2022, C++ console application, pretty straightforward. If you look over here on the right, I really don't have much here. All I've got is this main file. I don't have any classes. I don't have any additional header stuff. It's just a very simple application. And I have also added to my directory a CSV test.csv, which is the file that we showed before. It's nice because if you put a copy into your project directory, you can just double click and look at what you're dealing with. I've got another one, which is a little bit more complicated one. It's got more data, so I can make sure that if it works for the small one, it works for the big one. So really, it's just this code right here to do the application. So the includes I've got, ifstream, that's for the std cout cin. Fstream, the file stream, that's for the ifstream, and what we're going to use is the output file stream, where if we're going to send out to the file. Vector, again, we're making a vector of strings and such, a vector of doubles. And of course, string to do string manipulations. Stringstream for that output stringstream class I talked about, where you bring the file contents into this string stream. And then IO manipulation to set the cout precision. You're not going to need that, but we're just doing it to make it look nice. So again, I've got some to-do stuff, nothing much left. And here, the only thing I am initializing is a vector of double with the final answers. We said we're going to have some x values and we're going to have some y values, each in its own vector of doubles. And that's kind of the end result of this application. It creates those two vectors of doubles that you can then go and plot or whatever you want. And then I've got the methods that do the work, and I've got my int main. So let's take a look at int main. It's very, very simple, straightforward. I start out by defining a string, std string called file name, and I'm giving it the name of the CSV test.csv, which is this file inside our project. Very simple. I'm also defining a vector of strings called CSV records, and that's going to be, as we said before, once I read all of the records from the CSV file into a group of records, string format, it's going to be that. And then once we have that, we can go and we can parse the individual strings. All right? So I'm just defining a vector of strings called CSV records. Then what I'm doing is I'm going through and I'm calling a method that we'll look at where I just do the read from CSV. This is a method we're going to write, and you feed it the file name, the string of the file name, and it returns this CSV records vector of strings. All right? So it basically takes your CSV file, reads it into a vector of strings. Once we've got that, we can go through and parse it. So I've got another method we'll talk about, parse CSV to double, which takes those CSV records, and as we said before, it's going to parse them into the x vals and the y vals, all right? Vectors of doubles. So this is going to be the second method we're going to look at. And again, this is just for a very specific use case where I've got a vector of two doubles separated by a comma. That's why I like to put this into a method, because you can have like an OBJ file which requires a different parsing. But we're going to have a simple read it to a vector of strings and then parse it, and we're all set to go. And here is just going through each value and sending it to the output, as you can see right here. And it tells us how many records in this file, and it reads out the data that we have in the CSV file. Pretty straightforward. So very simple main, and the real work is going to be done here with these methods. So I've got 1, 2, 3, 4 methods. All right. I've got a file open error. When you open a file, you try to open a file for read or write, all this is going to do is it's just going to print out an error message. So for example, if I go in here and change my CSV test to CSV test 1 and run this, it's going to say, could not open file CSV test.csv. Do you know what you're doing? Apparently not. So that's all this does. It just says, you know, if you get an error in this code, just call this method and it will tell you the path that you were trying to open. And it will just print this out and give you a failure. So do however you want, but it's pretty straightforward. Write to CSV we'll talk about in a bit. And the two main methods are read from CSV and then parse CSV to double, like we talked about before. This read from CSV returns the vector of strings. And all we have to do is feed it a path, const std string path, and it will return to us that vector of strings that we can then feed into this parse CSV to double, and it will then parse them into the x vals and y vals up here, right? So again, we'll take a look at this read from CSV, and here's the read from CSV. You send it a path, and we're defining a string, total CSV contents string. And that's what we showed before. It's got all of the contents in one big string. Stores the contents of the CSV as one long string of characters. So the first thing, we need to define where this file is going to be stored. And we're going to use, as we said, define an object of the output stringstream class called myStringstream. So std o stringstream, we'll call it myStringstream. is std o string stream and initialized to 0. So now we know we've got a handle to the string stream object that will hold the data read from the file. All right. So the first thing we do, we got to make a new ifstream object. Again, that's a class for the input file stream. We have to associate that with a path and open it. And of course, the path is the path that we're going to feed it. So std ifstream input file. So our ifstream object is called input file, and we're going to feed it the path. So now we have the input file that we can access, and it's going to open that file at that path. If it fails, if input file is not opened, file open error path, right? And that's where we call the thing, hey, we couldn't open it, do you know what you're doing, right? So that's it. At this point, the input file at that path should be open and ready to go. So now we're at this point where we can use the read buffer method of our input file object, but it has to get a pointer to this oStringstream class called myStringstream, and then it can read it into myStringstream's buffer. So here's our input file, the read buff, and it reads it into the string stream. It's got the pointer and it reads it. And then we've got the myStringstream, and we are taking that oStringstream object and using the string method to make it into a string, which we call total CSV content string. So that's got the entire contents of the file as one big string. So now that we have the contents in one big long string, if we're going to use this getLine method, it works on a string stream. So the next thing we're going to do is convert this long string of data into a string stream. And we're going to use this input string stream, std input string stream, and we're going to feed it the string that we just made, total CSV content string, and it's going to return as my CSV string stream, which is a string stream that getLine can work on. All right. So now we have my CSV string stream, and we're also going to define our vector of string, which is the final records in string format. And the individual record is a string that we're going to extract using getLine, and then we're going to push all those onto records to get our final vector of strings. So we just initialize that, and here is where getLine does all the work. It takes my CSV string stream, which is the string stream, input string stream, and it's going to place each line into this record, which is a string. So it's a while loop, and getLine, the nice thing about getLine is it automatically looks for new line characters without telling it anything. So getLine is going to look for a new line character in this string stream and place the results into the record. And then the while loop basically takes each record as it finds it and pushes it into this vector of strings called records. So at the end of this while loop, we should have our records vector of strings filled with all of the records. And at this point, all we're going to do is we're going to look at the size of that after it's been built, and we're going to print out how many records in the path. And then we will return this string vector called records. So now, at the end of this read from CSV, we have generated a vector of string with all of the records in the file. So now, in our main, after we've done that, we've gotten to this point, now we've got to parse it. We're taking that CSV records vector of string and we're going to parse it to doubles. And we're going to use this method. So let's take a look at our parse CSV to double method. And it turns out we're going to use very similar methodologies we did for the reading from the file. We're going to use getLine and some other stuff. Also, we want to make this kind of a generic method. It's taking in a vector of strings as if you had read that from a CSV file. So it's kind of generic. I'm going to call that vector of strings CSV record strings, and each line of the CSV file is one string. And it's not going to return anything. It's going to return void, because what it's going to do is it's going to fill in these x vals and y vals with the values from the file. So we're going to feed it this vector of strings called CSV record strings. And internally, we're going to have a vector of string called values. And like we did with the records, we're going to push back each value into this vector of values, all right? And the individual value that we read is a string called value, all right? Same as record and records. We're also going to calculate the values per line just so we can keep track and print it out. So this for loop does all the parsing. So we parse each line that looks like 0, 25.63 into individual string elements called value, right? So 0 will be a value, 25.63 will be a value. And then we place them in the string vector called values. So we're going to extract this 0, push it into the, push that back into the values vector, then 25.63, push that into the values vector, and so on. So for int I equals 0 to the CSV record strings dot size, we again need to take our string and convert it to a string stream. We're going to call it ststream. And so each element of that vector is going to be converted to a string stream so the get line can work on it like we did last time. So the difference here is getLine in the previous method, we took advantage of its ability to automatically sense a new line character. Here we're going to specify the character as the comma, because again, each line is a 0, comma number, right? So we're going to give it a delimiter here. So getLine with the string stream, and it's going to output to the value using this comma delimiter. Each time it encounters a value, it's going to increment, and then it takes the values, push back the value that getLine just calculated, right? So at the end of it, we're going to have a vector of strings called values, and now all we need to do is convert those to doubles and put them in the arrays. And here is where we do that. We take each of those values, convert to double, and place in corresponding x vals and y vals vector double arrays. So we start out with j equals 0, while j is less than values.size, so it's going to go through the entire values, and x vals push back, we're going to take values j, convert to string to double, and then push that back onto x vals, and then the next element, j plus 1, is the y value, and we're going to push that back into y values. Then we have to increment j by 2, because we're taking j and j plus 1, so we have to increment it again to get the next pair, right? So at the end of this, we have pushed back doubles onto x vals and y vals, and that has basically converted everything into doubles that we can then plot or whatever. So let's run it with our big CSV file, CSV test final, and see if it works. And you can see it's got 38, 39 values. Number of records in CSV test final is 39. It's got all the x values and the y values. So it works. Again, if you want to modify or make another parsing method, you can do that. You just take in the string, the vector of strings, and you can parse it however you want. So that's about it for this one. If you're liking these videos, I encourage you to hit the like button, subscribe, hit the bell notifications, and most of all, let others know we're here. And by the way, if you have actually watched this entire video, I'd really appreciate it if you could make a comment. I don't think anybody watches my videos. The statistics for the last 5 years show that by far everybody watches just the first 4 minutes of my videos. So here we are at almost half hour, and I don't think anybody's here. So if you are, congratulations and appreciate a comment. Otherwise, take care. Have a really good day. Thanks.